The men that were staying at Holy Faith were here at noon standing outside the sanctuary. There's a kind of terrace. People would be in church, and then they would come out at 12 o'clock, and they couldn't escape seeing all the people. It was shocking, I think, to people to realize how many people needed a noontime lunch, or needed food, or needed a shower. We just always thought that was amazing. The people coming from church had to walk by these groups of people who were in need.
In the winter, there wasn't a safe place for women with children to go, to have a place to sleep. There were other shelters. There was St. Elizabeth's and the Salvation Army, but there were men there, and there was a question about how safe would they be with their children. And from that came the idea that we would do a sheltering of women with children in the winter in our various sanctuaries. And we managed to get cots and sleeping bags donated, and we would rotate. And the women could come in and spend the night, and we had volunteers giving them meals, and then a meal in the morning, and then they'd have to leave. And there are lots of issues there because we don't have showers here, and we have things that are of value, and we're opening our doors, and could things be stolen, and how do you keep it safe, and who's going to be here during the night to supervise? And that went on for a couple of years.
This is the parish hall called Palin Hall, named after Ellen Palin. This is where the men were temporarily housed before Pete's opened seasonally. The various faith groups would house the men and women different locations for 2 weeks at a time in their own facilities. And as welcoming as these faith groups were, they're really not set up to house people.
So we had a couple of temporary places that we were in for a season, and then it became clear we needed to be in our own place.
We evaluated other locations. Really in-depth studies, both in the sense of the price of the real estate, the location of it, accessibility, the existing zoning.
And then there was Pete's Pets, with a dinosaur on the roof. And could we make this into a shelter?
At one of our searches, we came across Pete's Pets, and at that time, Pete had closed the store, so he didn't mind to do a short lease for us, to be able to, kind of his cash flow going. So we rented 2 consecutive seasons before we approached the city.
Mayor Koss decided that the city of Santa Fe should buy a permanent location for us, because we knew that every year we would face the same uphill battle, finding a landlord willing to let us rent from them. The city laid down 3 or 4 conditions. One was that the shelter could not be too close to the plaza. The shelter could not be too close to the mall. The shelter had to be on a major bus line. The shelter had to have high visibility and be accessible to police and fire. And the last was that the shelter had to be in a commercially zoned district, which is where Pete's is. Pete's became the building that the city bought.
How do you convert a pet store into a shelter for the homeless? And among other things, you need an architect.
At that time, they asked me to sit on the board. My background in architecture and development kind of help a little bit to steer the project, see what it takes to make it function well for the shelter. And because of being volunteer and knowing the shelter kind of very in-depth, I knew exactly what it needed to make the current space work for our purposes.
Vahid had all the ability, envisioning how it needed to be, how to get there. He gave hours and hours and hours of his life. Many builders would not want to deal with a bunch of people coming in to tell you how you ought to be doing it because they thought it was their project too. He was just very patient with us.
It was fun probably at the first few days, but when the reality sets in of we had the time constraint, we had to get these things done so the shelter can be open.
We had a lot of fun. We did a lot of the demo work ourselves because we couldn't afford to pay people. And what little boy doesn't want to take up a sledgehammer and smash something?
You know, we had a lot of people in the good spirits that they did a lot of the hard work for the shelter.
One of our long-standing board members who had himself been homeless for years, Ray Masterson, is the man who used to ride around Santa Fe on a tricycle pulling a wagon with his dog, always a husky. He had found housing through the city, but we had to rent a little bobcat because those fish tanks, it was rebar covered with steel mesh, covered with concrete. We could not, with sledgehammers, demo those things. So we rented a little bobcat, and Ray had so much fun driving that bobcat through those fish tanks and through we would knock out the plasterboard and he'd drive them through the 2x4 uprights. And when it was, well, we were all, my wife would say we were like little boys playing with our erector set.
I wasn't too much involved with that labor work. I'm glad to hear that they had some fun, but it's hard for me to imagine that at the moment. But sometimes also, you know, when you look back stuff, although it's painful at the time, you feel like it wasn't as bad. So maybe they're looking at it at now and they say, oh, it was fun. But
we worked hard 5 days a week, sometimes 6, because we had a strict deadline. We knew as soon as the shelter closed, we had to start the demo work. I always like to brag. The Pope recently put in 2 showers in Vatican City for homeless people. The Pope has 2, we have 4.
Eventually, we got the building into shape to serve as a come-as-you-are homeless shelter. We outfitted it with offices for the various providers to provide the day services. We acquired bunk beds, fully fitted out kitchen. A tremendous amount of work went into creating this beautiful shelter space. And we were then able to open around 2010 and begin serving homeless people.
And I was recently asked, if you shelter people, you're saving them for the one night, but you're not really solving the problem of homelessness. And I said, yes, and that's why the shelter is, in some ways, an opportunity center. We don't just shelter people, but we give them access to medical care and dental care and counseling if they want it. It gives them a place where they can find these things so that they can get the treatment that they need and the medication that they may need. To begin to reclaim that place of dignity.